The EO, the executive order, was part of a suite of what a lot of people are seeing as an attack on science, an attack on, whether you want to call it an attack on inquiry or just an attack on research and researchers and their budgets and their work, that even if all of it gets rolled back, which seems unlikely, but even if all of it were to get rolled back, whether it's a court order or they roll it back because it is no longer the most popular part of what he's doing, et cetera, it's causing such consternation and such, honestly, existential dread among scientists that they are leaving the field or deciding not to do something. That, to me, hard to measure, but pernicious and probably a bigger problem.
Ivan Oransky, welcome to Heterodox Outloud.
Great to be here.
So you are a journalist, a medical journalist. Our listeners may know you as the co-founder of Retraction Watch. Tell us a bit about Retraction Watch.
Sure. So Retraction Watch is a site, a blog. Actually, it's how it started in 2010 with my good friend and colleague, Adam Marcus, about scientific fraud, obviously about retractions, which are often due to scientific fraud. And we're a journalism site that covers pretty much every day, sometimes more than once a day, a case or a story or something going on, whether it's in scientific publishing, some things going usually badly, but sometimes well in scientific publishing, again, fraud, retractions, and some other larger issues. We also have a database of retractions, the most comprehensive database of retractions that is now public and anyone can take a look at.
Yeah, it's an amazing asset. That's a huge visiting place for our Heterodox Academy members. You were an undergrad at Harvard. You did your MD at New York's NYU School of Medicine.
Correct. Yep.
And I heard that at Harvard you were also involved in the Crimson.
Yeah, I spent probably, and now I can admit this, the statute of limitations is ended, John, but I spent at least as much and probably more time at the Crimson, where we used to come out and print 6 nights a week or 6 mornings a week. And I loved it. And that's where I learned how to be a journalist. But I was also pre-med and, of course, ended up going to medical school as well.
Let's begin. On January 20th, President Trump passed an executive order which stated that the government recognizes 2 genders, male and female. I was reading last night that a poll that said that issue that executive order is President Trump's most popular issue. It's the item on which the strongest majority of people approve of him so far. In part, I think, because it's seen to be part of a fight against transgender ideology that many people have been talking about. But I also understand that President Trump's executive order has caused disruption in research. And we're going to talk about that disruption together. That'll be our main topic today. I just wonder if we can just start just in a word. How serious is the disruption caused by research, caused to research by this executive order? Just briefly, we'll come back to it, but just start us off with a teaser, if you would.
Yeah, I would say 2 things quickly. One is that it has caused a lot of people very quickly to scramble to sort of scrub their papers. In fact, and part of, I don't know if it was exactly part of the executive order, but it was part of a related sort of suite of orders and sort of rulings, if you will, that researchers who use certain language, including language that you would use to describe, people identified as trans and what have you like that, had to withdraw any manuscripts that were under consideration. And that to me, at a high level, means that inquiry is being quashed or at least limited. And then the anticipatory obedience of what people are doing, even if it's not related directly to that, I think that's a big problem. I think, though, that, just to put this in perspective a little bit, again, briefly, is that the EO, the executive order, was part of a suite of what a lot of people are seeing as an attack on science, an attack on, whether you want to call it an attack on inquiry or just an attack on research and researchers and their budgets and their work, that even if all of it gets rolled back, which seems unlikely, but even if all of it were get rolled back, whether it's court order or they roll it back because it is no longer the most popular part of what he's doing, et cetera, it's causing such consternation and such, honestly, existential dread among scientists that they are leaving the field or deciding not to do something. That, to me, hard to measure, but pernicious and probably a bigger problem.
We're going to loop back to that issue and discuss it. It's a fascinating topic. I want to, before we move to that, I want to now to go backwards in time a little bit and frame some of these issues about the relationship of government funding to science for our listeners. So that when we do that particular, we approach this particular question, we can have that background. And as I understand, the movement of government funding into research at universities is a relatively new phenomenon. In the 1940s, for example, my understanding is that most universities were reluctant to take funding from government on the research side because they wanted to have their own independence. I think academic freedom in those days was thought to be perhaps threatened by new funding sources from government, perhaps presciently, but it's a complicated issue as we'll be finding out. Can you just say a little bit about that? I mean, my understanding was that, and Vannevar Bush, I think, is really an important figure that you and I were talking about before we came on the show in this process. So, how did government start funding research in science, and what were some of the issues when that happened?
Yeah, so I'm going to, for 30 seconds, take us even further back and just sort of set the stage a little bit.
I love going back further. Stepping back is my favorite thing to do. So step back.
Just not off the cliff. Exactly. Just I'm glad we both went there. Maybe I'm disturbed we both went there. I think because and the reason I want to do this is a couple trend lines. Like one trend line is how much money it actually costs to do research. And, we can talk about, and I think we will talk about, that there's fraud and there's various things, problems in that, inherent in any human endeavor. However, there's really no denying that it has become much, much, much more expensive to do research today than it was in, the 1940s when we're talking about Vannevar Bush, and I want to get back to that in a second. But let's go back 400 years or even 500 years. It cost, I don't want to say nothing, but like relatively nothing to do fundamental work. How much, investment did Isaac Newton need? Now, he needed some, but there were sort of patricians who could support basically what we needed. I'm oversimplifying here and probably maybe even unfairly, but there's no question that the cost of research, it's buying lab equipment, it's buying reagents, it's like buying mice that transgenic mice that are, bred to sort of have a certain disease or not have it. Things like that are, or building telescopes, right? You spend as much building a world-class telescope on top of a mountain now as maybe the entire budget of whatever year in the 1900s. So the reason I want to just push on that a little bit is that the money has to come from somewhere if you want science. Now, if we as a society or as a government, or hopefully a government that is reflecting the will of society at least, decide we don't need that and they can go do it however they want, that's a decision. It's one I vehemently disagree with. I think that science and research, when done well, which a lot of it is the best way, maybe the only good way to understand the world better. And therefore, whether you want to talk about applied knowledge and coming up with new, vaccines and drugs, or just knowing how stuff works, which is pretty damn important and fascinating, like there's no other way to do it other than to have funds for it. So if we can't, and there may be people who disagree with me on that and say not so much that it wouldn't cost money, but we shouldn't prioritize that. I respect that. Again, disagree with it. But if you therefore then sort of track that historically against the trend line of government involvement in funding, right? It tracks, because what was happening in the 1940s, right? It was a bit pre-Sputnik, right? So obviously, but
Manhattan Project,
exactly. There were needs that scientists, or at least that people felt scientists, and I would agree, were uniquely positioned to fill. So therefore, to fulfill. So therefore, you had a need for funding. Now, you had a need for structure, you had a need for all sorts of things, but you had a need for a workforce. And so it was not purely a competitive play at that time. It became one, right? So, you could have started the NIH or sort of created what is now the NIH in the 1940s, and then nothing else really happened. And it kind of went along. Well, now it's, you could argue, a behemoth. It's looking at give or take a $50 billion budget. And so one of the things that happened there was that not only did they say, well, we should fund, research grants, we should fund specific research, we should also fund what are known now as indirect costs, right? Overhead costs, the costs of heating a building at a university, or of hiring administrative staff, or doing things that you need in order to actually manage this process, which is the sort of unsung heroes in many ways of what goes on. Over time, so Bush himself actually sort of, he was, I wouldn't put sort of emotions in his head, but he was actually a bit frustrated, maybe surprised that universities at that time said, well, we don't really want that. Like, they were more open to the idea of funding, but the sort of indirect costs, like, we don't want our sort of core needs to be funded by government, because then the government will have too much control over it, which I think is fascinating, because that is an argument you hear a lot from, I would argue, the right.
Yes, of course.
You don't hear it much from the left.
It's most famous with Hillsdale College, who refused to take federal funding so that they could have autonomy in a whole variety of ways.
And you also see people say, well, the reason why climate change research sort of always seems to point in a particular direction is because of the need to seek funding from agencies like EPA or from NSF, and also NOAA, that sort of go a certain way, if you will. And I think, or at least have, and I think, but if you sort of couple that with, not couple it with, but if you then go through history again a little bit, I'll just do this somewhat briefly. Over time, that notion of indirect costs, which are being directly attacked right now by the Trump administration, this notion of indirect costs has swung pendulum-wise over time. Sometimes probably for good reason, other times in reaction to something bad that happened. So, for example, scandal in the really sort of late 80s, early 90s about it being, some of these funds being misused and sort of used on what they really shouldn't have been, or at least people didn't think they should be.
For example, the yacht.
For example, a yacht at Stanford University, so that they could attract big donors who also like yachts, right? And I like yachts. I've only been on a few, but.
And I was telling you before we came on that I was teaching at Stanford at the time when that whole scandal was breaking, and it was front page news in the in the local papers.
So things swung back, and then again, as you might expect, Congress and what have you said, well, that's terrible. We've got to pull these things back. They then crept that back up, and then there were some other times when they also again shrunk. It's sort of a cycle, and then a couple of years ago, and this is what people are pointing out as this sort of as these Trump comments and sort of orders start to come out, is that Congress, I think, probably in anticipation of what might happen, essentially enshrined a certain overall rate of indirect costs, but also more importantly said it's an act of it requires an act of Congress to change that. You can't just do that. Next president, whoever he might be, well, guess what? He's trying to do that. Again, all of this as by way of saying funding for research, I would argue, is critical. And the problem is that if you say, well, we're not going to fund it, the government shouldn't fund it, or it should fund it less, someone else is probably going to come in and sweep in and actually replace that. And in the case of clinical medicine and clinical research, that's almost exclusively industry. So it's a bit of careful what you wish for, or harm reduction, if you want to think of it. In other words, there are a lot of people who object strenuously to industry funding research, and yet they're the only ones who can afford to do it in clinical trials. So if you're saying, let's remove all government funding, you're only going to have more of that. Or you're, I guess, going to get rid of science, which I hope not.
And in one of the pieces you've written for HXA, it may have been the interview that you did in our Substack, Free the Inquiry, you talk about, as I recall, it's there, you talked about in the 40s that because universities were reluctant to take direction and research money from the government, they required overhead indirect cost rates of around 50%. At a time when private industries who were being enlisted into various government projects were requiring even more. They were requiring 100%, for example. So there was an early phase, and we know now it's become more complex, and there's a variable rate. The different universities they pay different amounts. What I wanted just to mention and get your thoughts on is that things are dramatically changed from a period where universities are reluctant to take federal money. We recently did a podcast with Open the Books, which is a transparency organization, where we went through a lot of the data on the scale and scope of federal funding for universities. And one of the findings that a lot of our listeners were surprised about was that in the Ivy League in recent years, the Ivy League schools make more money, more revenue from their government grants than they do from tuition dollars by quite a large number. That doesn't even include the benefits to universities from the tax exemptions, but just straight up on the grants, they make more than tuition, which raises sort of these questions about what universities and researchers who care about our research most of all, care about our scholarship and our teaching, hopefully care about that most of all, what we owe to the public who's funding it all. And, there's a question about legitimacy, like with President Trump and this executive order, which is causing a lot of consternation in the scientific community. As we know, President Trump was democratically elected. He has, as the head of the executive branch, he has certain constitutionally designated powers. Those powers, the parameters of those powers are contested and are being decided now in courts and so forth. But there is this fact that the executive branch has significant control granted to them by the public to think about these things and to act on them in various ways. There's a long history of presidents being involved in science, but the legitimacy depends on the choice of the people, not on whether the policy is good or bad for science. That's an obvious fact, but I think sometimes in these discussions, people think that if they can show that something, or if they have to have a discussion even like we're about to have, of whether an order is good or bad for science, they are ipso facto, or perhaps in a closet way, in a Trojan horse way, just saying something about the legitimacy of the governing agency. Those are probably two separate issues. There may be some connections within them. If we find that an executive order is bad for science and we think science is good for society, then we might think this executive order is bad for society. But that's just a complicated nexus of things that are background political theory, I suppose. I just want to keep in mind before we launch into executive order. Do you want to say anything more about that, or do you want to?
Yeah, I mean, on the one hand, I just want to say that I am very, very far from being a political theorist, and so what I'm about to say is sort of a layperson's view on this. I think, having followed policy a bit, of course, I think that it gets to this tension of what do you believe, or do you prioritize, I should say, free inquiry, or do you prioritize sort of only certain kinds of inquiry? And so in other words, if you, again, don't think that government should be funding research, then I mean, again, I would disagree with it, but that's the end of the discussion, because it's sort of like, well, it doesn't matter what the executive says you can or can't say, or you can or can't study. But I think that most people, and if you look, for example, historically at one of the reasons why the NIH budget, although sometimes presidents and even Congress sort of, well, mostly presidents threaten to cut the budget, it very rarely really gets cut. Now, it may stay flat, which is an effective cut. Okay, fine, details. Point being, it is enormously popular. It has the word health in it, right? And even if there are problems in it, which honestly, that's what Retraction Watch reports on a lot, at its core, it is a popular idea. So I think there's another layer here of, I don't know how to articulate this exactly, but there's another layer here of what people think is actually happening and what maybe an executive says is happening, right? And that's a whole sort of bunch of discussion of propaganda and what have you, but on both sides. But I think it is complex, I guess, is sort of the answer. I'm reminded of John, this may or may not be a relevant sort of analogy, but I'm reminded of a case that I know about someone who was being sued by a doctor who was being sued because there had been a bad outcome in a pregnancy. The grandmother, who was actually taking care of the baby, sort of recognized that, in fact, she was the one suing because a lawyer had said, you should sue, and you might get money and the rest of it. She said every time she came to that doctor's office, she would say, "You saved my grandson's life," which is true. there was a bad outcome that was utterly unavoidable, which is what the court eventually, or the jury eventually decided. So it's sort of like, well, what are you prioritizing?
Nice.
And
nice. I'll mention that I was listening to some videos last night, just catching up on news broadcasts. And this will sound very nerdy about my nightlife in New York, but I was I was watching a series of videos of Trump appointees' announcements about how they're running their various agencies. And I spent a lot of time listening to some talks by Robert Kennedy about his role at the Agency of Health. And one of the things the main point he kept making is that to make America healthy again, we need to make American science healthy again. And what he said was that when his uncle was the president of the United States, and what he sees as sort of the heyday, the high point of American power and prestige in the world, that prestige of American science depended upon this idea that American science was unusually transparent and unusually committed to open inquiry. And he says he wants to restore those ideals to science. Now, whether that's true and what we make about that, I don't really know. But I was so struck, from my perspective at HXA, hearing this person go on at some considerable length about the importance of transparency, that science relies upon the exchange of ideas. So I wanted that as even some more background. Now I'm going to move to the main.
Can I comment
of course you
briefly
may.
on
Please,
that? I
please.
think, look, it's very interesting. And Adam, again, Marcus and I, he's my co-founder at Retraction Watch, we published a piece in The Atlantic just last week about that really started riffing on RFK Jr.'s nomination, his Senate confirmation hearings, and the fact that he kept, talking about this research by this one researcher. And there's a sort of, if you will, I think superficial and maybe even certainly genuine desire to have more transparency. I think, though, that some of that has been, if not weaponized, then maybe co-opted by people who, including RFK Jr., who use that to sort of point to any one bit of evidence, which may be flawed anyway, but any one bit of evidence that, it's not being published or it finally got published and here it is. That's what he was doing at the hearings. This was about vaccines and autism, not surprisingly. And what they do, though, is a sleight of hand. And I think we need to call people to account for this, because saying transparency is great. I'm all for it. We say that all the time. And I doubt that you would disagree, John, right? But transparency also requires responsibility. I mean, science requires responsibility and claims require evidence. And part of that evidence has to be all of the evidence that contradicts what you're claiming. And since it's so overwhelming in the case of autism and vaccines to continually point, so it's a case where I'm concerned about not too much transparency, but about a complete lack of filter, right? Because at the end of the day, some science is going to hold up and some isn't. And some of it, we may learn more about it even if it's wrong. But transparency is great, but it's got to come. It's like with great power comes great responsibility. With great transparency comes the need to filter and be, skeptical of things that you disagree with.
Let me ask you about the executive order of January 20th, that the government now hereby recognizes only two genders, male and female. And they don't say sex, they say genders, which is relevant, as we'll see in a moment. Just help me understand the pathway from that executive order, that declaration, to claims that I'm hearing from some of our members and some of my team members as well, I'll add, that the executive order seems to require that there be no mentioning of terms such as gender, transgender, lesbian, bisexual, gay, and I could even add more terms, non-binary, but also terms like exclusion and other terms I could add in addition to that. What's the pathway between an executive order saying that there are two genders, which I think is meant to be part of the fight back against transgender ideology in a broader cultural context? What's the pathway from that to research, and how has research been affected by that order? So it's the big question. So here we are.
So here we are. And so I think one of the things to just point out, it's not the major point here, but one of the things to just point out is that the United States, and again, I'm not a political scientist, we recognize certain countries exist, right? We recognize that China exists. We recognize there is a place in the world called Taiwan. We recognize that there's a place in the world, different places that are contested, let's call it that. Now, it's one thing to say, this is our official position, but you want to have a conversation about any of it, go for it. Like, we may disagree with that position. As the State Department, we won't do X, Y, or Z, but you want to have that conversation. That's what's not happening is the second half of that. So it's one thing to say, we recognize, and I'm not here to argue for or against recognizing two genders. It's such a complicated issue that, I don't claim to be a good student of it, a trained student of it. However, what I do see is beyond that, you can't talk about it. You cannot have a discussion of whether or not, you cannot include, as you pointed out, certain words that would at least imply, if not directly endorse the idea that we're wrong about that, or that there are more than two genders or two sexes, right? And that's where that has I think that has a very pernicious effect on science. Just in the sense of, like, literally now they have to scrub things the way, Stalin or Lenin would have scrubbed, texts they didn't like. But also because it basically means you can't study that, or you can't publish anything if you're a government employee or government funded. You can't publish anything about that. Why would you want to shut down inquiry like that? And I think that, and again, as part of the larger set of orders and the larger set of statements and pronouncements, this is basically saying to scientists, you can only do what we want you to do. It's going to drive a lot of people, I think smart, talented, hardworking people, who might come up with the next big idea or big treatment or what have you, away from it. Because why deal with that?
Let me ask a question that may seem and actually be simple-minded. So there's an executive order saying that the government recognizes two genders, male and female. If I'm a scientist, could I write a paper that argues for that position? That says, in fact, there are no other genders than these two? The order seems to allow that. Or does it? When I asked you, what I keep hearing from people is that the order seems to require that there not be mentions, right, of terms such as gender, transgender, lesbian, blah blah blah. But is that what the order is? Is that the way the order is being received and the impact, or is that required by the order? Is this a misunderstanding of the order? Because I'm not sure it's better to say you can only have research on this question if you argue in a particular way. That seems highly directive on the part of the government and very anti-open inquiry in a whole variety of ways. But that's different than saying these terms can't be mentioned. Which world are we in?
So, and again, this is where the particulars are critically important. And so, what I understand is that the order itself is really just, obviously only for government, not funded, but government employees. So, Center for Disease Control, CDC, et cetera, NIH, what have you, NSF. It would be less relevant there, but certainly relevant. So you could argue, well, that's a limited number. It's a pretty large number, and I would argue that it's still an important group of people. You could have that discussion somewhere else if you're not. And I think where it's a little bit unclear is funded by. So in other words, if you have an NIH grant, are you allowed to, sort of use these words, or will those be pulled back too? So, but I would say that you could not make an argument. Well, you could make an argument. It would be not a very good argument. How do you argue for something without acknowledging what other people think, right? This is basic argumentation sort of rhetoric, at least taking that into account. So, for example, if you say, these are the things that I think are wrong, but you're not allowed to use those words, that's pretty bad. Now, again, if you're completely out of that system, or if you're not funded by government, you don't have to think about that. Theoretically, you could still publish whatever you wanted. What I'm seeing, though, is that everyone is interpreting this as, when you do that, you will be targeted in some way. Maybe they will audit your university. Maybe they'll audit. This is starting to happen. And so that's where I think, even if it's not officially in the, it is important to know what the EO says, because if people are going to fight it in courts and and legislation. Well, it's critically important.
Of course.
On the other hand,
of course.
the effect on behavior, like the actual effect, I think it's a pond, and the ripples are really pretty significant.
And people are calling this anticipatory obedience.
Absolutely.
And they're very concerned about it. And I know, again, from talking to a lot of members about this, that anticipatory obedience can have sort of two different flavors, I suppose, I believe. One flavor is people being obedient in anticipation of likely outcomes, likely negative outcomes. The other flavor is people exaggerating the effects of the order because they dislike the order itself.
Yes.
So there's some of that both going on, because we're
absolutely
as complicated humans with different kind of motivations, different political priors. People are reading these orders in different ways. I want to ask you about the CDC. As I understand it, the CDC is, I think, has issued an order with that all papers being considered for external review be withdrawn. So papers are out for external review, the normal process of science evaluation. And there's an order saying that those papers under review be withdrawn from external review and being required to pass through a pre-review by someone in the Trump administration or some agency. Is that roughly right?
It is right. And just to be clear, because this is the argument that some people are making, saying, well, this is actually just sort of okay, and I would disagree with that. But papers do, if you talk to someone at like in a NIH or CDC or anywhere, all papers actually have to go through someone before they are published somewhere. And that's kind of, you can argue about that, but it's really purely an administrative, like, did you report the affiliations of everyone? Did you report the funding? Did you report any conflicts of interest? Like, very sort of administrative. It's not about the content.
So it's a formal content neutral.
It's totally content neutral. Right. But in this case, it is not content neutral. And I'm not even sure they're interested in all those administrative issues. They're interested in making sure that certain words aren't in these papers.
We keep on moving to the words. I'm still just puzzled by that, because as I read the executive order, and I'm not a lawyer, but I read it a couple of times to sort of see what I could make of it, I didn't see them saying you can't speak certain words. Am I misunderstanding this?
Well, again, what they're doing it in a couple of different ways, right? So, I'd have to go back and look, and I'm not disputing what you're saying at all. Saying I want to fact check it for myself. I'd need to go back and look at what the executive order actually says in terms of words. But I don't think it's unreasonable, I guess, and this gets back to whether it's anticipatory obedience or just interpretation. I don't think it's unreasonable to sort of triangulate some of what is coming out of the administration and saying this is what they're after. And maybe that's as best. Maybe that may be the best evidence we have. And again, I don't rely on people taking screenshots and posting them on social media of this thing coming out.
Sure.
I think we need a better level of evidence than that.
Yeah. People are acting, scientists are acting as though the order does ban naming of identities or identities themselves from research. What impact does that have on scientific research in these areas?
And again, let me say that has there been, there's even evidence that there's been sort of overreach on that in fact some of the way that, and I mean in terms of research in the past, in other words, the way that people have described particular populations or self-described maybe has made things more confusing for research. So I want to just be upfront about that, because again, simply, you need to agree on terms, or at least understand terms if you're doing research. And so now I think this is if that's the reason that they're sort of making these statements and new regulations and new policies, I think that's way overreaching. I mean, there are other ways to do with that are less, well, certainly not political. So I think that, so the problem is you have groups of people who describe themselves a certain way. And by the way, it's not just, and again, you discuss, trends, ideology and things like that. It's not just even in that realm. I mean, I think there's actually some questions about whether you can sort of talk about, I saw one thing sort of whether you can talk about like women as underrepresented in research, which they are sometimes for structural, well-intentioned, but eventually bad reasons, like pregnancy and sort of basically calling every woman, below the age of 55 or something, potential in birth, child-rearing years, and basically excluding them from research for that. And that's all bad. Like that was just overreach itself, maybe well-intentioned. But if you...
I'm sorry, when was this happening?
Oh, this was happening until, it's still, in some ways it's still happening, but there are, if you look at the exclusion criteria.
Before January 20th.
Oh, way before. No, this is something going back to the 60s, and maybe earlier, when you had clinical trials. My point is, like, is there something that needed to get fixed, I guess is what I'm getting at. And that is something that I think actually has been slowly getting fixed, but still could use some work. But that doesn't seem to be the sort of purpose of this. So this is sort of getting us to a point where you can't differentiate people in a lot of different ways. Now, maybe it's okay to differentiate height. So you're taller than I am, John. So there'll be a table if we're both in a clinical trial, that's okay. But can we talk about anything else in terms of identity? And if you severely limit, right, no matter where that line is, and I take your point that, is it in the EO? Is it, important questions, but there is some limitation. And if you limit the populations that you can talk about, then you therefore limit the populations that you can study effectively. And you end up with, a lot of research is too overgeneralized as it is. In other words, we say that the same thing will work for you and me and then like 12 other people here in Times Square who are totally different from we are, have different genetics. So already we're doing that. And now we're going to make that problem even worse because we're basically going to say, well, there's kind of one kind of study subject, and everything's going to work for them.
So let's continue on this politicized element, if we can, for a moment. I know people who are extremely upset about this executive order. I know other people who are extremely happy about it. Part of the culture wars that are going on, and people have good reasons to have strong feelings on both sides of that issue, it seems to me. There's been a lot of strange things and controversies and squelching of viewpoints for some time now. And we're seeing it now associated with this executive order, with the people on the political left, to speak broadly, being most alarmed. But it wasn't so long ago that people on the political right were the ones who were extremely alarmed. Can you talk a little bit about that? What is this an equal opportunity error of government involvement in science? Or can you say something about the structure or the nature of that? How it is that claims start limiting science? What's the power? What's the talisman, if there is one, that allows people's worries about these issues, their political worries about these issues, to find their way into science and to effectively constrain it? What's the power source?
Fascinating, right? So, and I think this gets back to the USC meeting that you referred to and where we met, right?
The USC meeting in early January on censorship and science, which is available online. You should check it out. It's a great YouTube video.
And I think
that's my
thank
plug.
You. Yeah, well, I'm part of the people should watch and maybe argue about and disagree with my talk too. That's available there. I think that this is where this is interesting to me and problematic, and that's why I think we need to explore it and be transparent about it. Is that it's a form of censorship. I mean, and in this case, it's literally censorship because it's the government. Like, we talk about censorship a lot, and people sort of go to that, oh, well, if it's not the government, it's not censorship. I'm not sure how useful that argument is, but let's just call it censorship with a lowercase c. So for many years, you've seen cases, many of which we've covered at Retraction Watch, of papers being, for example, retracted because basically, and not basically, there are journals that say this is what they're doing. Well, there's nothing wrong about the results, right?
Nothing scientifically wrong about
Nothing scientifically incorrect. And every paper has flaws. We're humans, and you want that because, not that you want flaws, but you don't want people to wait until everything's absolutely buttoned down, because
of course,
other than the law of gravity, there aren't too many things like that. So,
and even that's... but go on.
See, this is physics. I shouldn't have even said that, John, because I know somebody is probably going to... Point taken. The point is that they were being retracted because the results, while as robust as any other results, might do harm. Right? That's not a great reason to retract a paper or to. And by the way, again, just term of art or sort of detail here. Retraction doesn't actually mean removing it from the world. It shouldn't. It means stamping it as retracted. You should not trust this or rely on it. So you're not removing it from creation. You're just, again, you're labeling it. But the problem is that when you retract something for harm, or sort of say, don't trust this because it might produce harm, even if it's true, that's a problem. And I would argue that, and so that's been happening to people, like Michael Bailey, who spoke at the meeting as well, and who try and study, what they're studying in trans, like biology, or in sort of some of these issues and what have you, in other fields too, abortion. And so I would argue that what's happening now in terms of whether the executive order or what the effect of the executive order and the language is the same thing. They're saying it would be harmful to allow this kind of conversation and to allow that there are more than two genders, sexes. And so therefore, we're going to shut it down, right? And the reason I push on that is because I want people to see that no matter where you are on the political spectrum or on what you believe in science or trust or what have you, if you are shutting down inquiry, if you are shutting or sort of saying, let's not trust this result because it could be dangerous, harmful, you're engaged in the same activity. Now, if you want to do that, I think that's bad. But if you want to do that, at least be consistent. So if you're someone who is shutting things down, say, again, broadly speaking, on the left, for that, well, that's true, but it could be dangerous. And some of those papers, by the way, are actually flawed and should be retracted. But a lot of them, it's just because of harm. Well, then you should actually be saying, okay, I see what you're doing over there, because you've aided and abetted. I want to give an example.
You mean, sorry, what you're doing over there with this new executive order, you're saying?
Yeah, exactly.
That's
you should recognize the behavior. You should recognize the strategy and maybe either agree with it, which I wouldn't argue for, but sort of recognize that recognize that you have, I would argue, aided and abetted that strategy by making it okay to squelch in some way discussions, findings, research that you thought would be harmful. Because the people who agree, I don't want to obviously overgeneralize or read their minds, but I would imagine that there are among the people you described who sort of say, I'm for this, like we should only talk about two genders. They're probably thinking, and maybe in a sort of well-intentioned way, doing anything otherwise harms people. So therefore, let's stop doing it, even though it's not reality. And so I want to give a quick example, which has nothing to do with any of this, but I think
when you say it's not reality, you mean there was actually no harm. Is that what you mean?
Well, no, I mean that what you're claiming is or isn't true. There's no reality to that. In other words, not no reality, but it's wrong. The facts of it, like there are two genders or whatever, like it's definitely more complex than that. If it's as complex as a lot of people would claim, maybe not, but it is more complex. And Alice Dreger actually wrote a whole book that involved this. I would say I want to give an example that's sort of removed from this. So bear with me because it's probably going to seem unrelated for a second, but I think it gives a sense of one way forward. Right. So in the 1980s, the New England Journal of Medicine published this very brief letter, right, from this very august, Harvard hospital researcher, physician, saying essentially that he saw that when he was wandering around the hospital and talking to people who had chronic pain, and I think it was due to cancer in this case, I'm pretty sure of that, and they were on opioids, right? They didn't develop dependence. Okay, now that's that's a happy news story. Well, it's a horrible story because there are people in pain. But in terms of it's a positive thing. Like, good, okay, so we don't have to worry about those people getting addicted to opioids. Let's make them comfortable. Okay, that's the message. And guess who really liked that message, right? Pharma, in particular the Sackler family and Purdue, loved that message. They got that message into the hands of everyone they could, every doctor who could prescribe it, et cetera, for decades. And at some point, and really after a lot of what the Sackler family was about and the Purdue was about became evident, New England Journal of Medicine, again, decades later, so this is, I want to say, less than 10 years ago, they put a note at the top of that paper saying, listen, this isn't actually wrong, because it was his perception. He wasn't claiming he had done some massive study. This isn't wrong, and we're not retracting it, but we're putting this sort of editor's note on it saying, you really shouldn't cite it because it's totally misleading. In other words, we now know so much more. We barely knew anything. Here's what happened because of it. And I actually give him credit for that. Maybe it's too late. You could do it differently. But there's something about having a discussion in the pages of the journal, maybe right on top of it, and flagging it not as like, oh my God, it's going to maybe harm someone, because it did harm people, and it says that, but not retracting it from the world or saying, you can't talk about this. That doesn't go anywhere good.
And so I'm hearing you say that the key concept that unites some of the censorship from the left in recent years through federal funding for science to what we may now describe as censorship from the right on research and science, federally funded research and science. The underlying concept is something like the concept of harm. And again, just dipping a little bit into the history, I suppose that people could talk about the Scopes trial as being to do with harm. We could talk about Galileo's trial as being to do with harm. So there seems to be a long, long history of this question of, on the one hand, there's something like I think there's something like a drive towards scientific, I'm going to call it scientific integrity, or maybe it's scientific autonomy. And I think scientists think that integrity and autonomy are closely connected concepts, that only insofar as they're allowed to freely, as the experts, be the ones to decide for themselves which topics should be discussed, which ones should not be discussed, and they face the rigors of peer review and criticism, and no one gets a free pass in that world. It's a very it's generally a very competitive world.
I'm giving you a look, John, about peer review, but go on.
I caught that. But that's an idea of science. Mm-hmm. But again, going back to something I was saying at the start of this conversation, we live in a world where, in an era where the federal government and state governments are heavily involved in funding these projects. And the people in a democracy have some voice in what gets funded and what doesn't get funded. If we think about the reason why the public funds are used for science, one answer is it's purely for the good of science. We want to know things. We want to know how many stars there are. We want to know how many leaves are on trees. We want to know all different kinds of things as people interested in the world, interested in, let's say, significant facts about the world. Leaves on trees might not count. But they want to know things like how many stars there are. But then there's also a part of it which says that we fund science for the good of society, for the good of our world, for the good of the people. And so it's just an interesting little connection in there, right? Where there's harm to the people, doesn't seem completely alien to the underlying ideal, the underlying rationale for there being public funding at all. It's almost as though there needs to be some kind of maybe a necessary facing of this dilemma that harms can be defined in different ways by different people when they're in power. We want science to go on in some sense, having some sort of autonomy. I don't know what the answer is here at all. The issue gets more complicated for me the more I'm learning about it. Do you have any thoughts about that tension?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And I'm also going to just preface it by saying I don't have the answer either. What I have, I think, is some examples of or cases or case studies where people have grappled with this, sometimes successfully, sometimes not. One I'm thinking of is what are known as institutional review boards. So these are, roughly speaking, people call them ethics committees. They're not exactly that, but they're in charge of, and they're federally mandated for any human subjects research. If you want to do a clinical trial, or do anything involving people, you got to go through this IRB. And so one thing that happened that was interesting, and now this is pretty standard, but in the 60s when there were riots, in Newark in particular, but obviously in other places, these were, based on race issues and things like this, and protests. One of the things that came out of that was actually that the hospital, the major academic hospital there, started requiring that a member of the community be on the IRB, which really hadn't happened before. And so, if you put this in the context of, and this actually came out later, but the Tuskegee experiments that were, really quite awful ethically, to put it mildly, you start to sort of say, okay, well, there's a way that you can have representation and talk about the potential harms of research, not so much in terms of what the findings would be, but literally people in a trial being harmed. So again, everything's a little different. That still allows autonomy, right? And it still allows inquiry. That isn't to whitewash, IRBs and their issues, but at a high level, there's something about that. The other thing I would mention is historical. We keep getting back to history. We must both like history, John. And that is the Bayh-Dole Act of 1980. And the reason I mention that is not so much because it solved anything. It was trying to solve a problem, which maybe it partially solved. But again, it gets back to funding. So basically, in 1980, the sort of universities needed funding. The government saw that all of this potential intellectual property was coming out of them, whether it was technology or drugs or what have you. And they said, okay, you should go here. You're free now to commercialize that. Like there had been a lot of reluctance to sort of both, I don't know, morally, but also legally on universities and who owned the intellectual property, and especially if it was federally funded. And so that unleashed a whole industry of people who do that kind of work and all sorts of things. But if you look again at how science is funded now, universities are, I think that the right may look at, I don't want that much funding for research. And if it is, it's got to be in certain areas. But if you look at the overall dollars, industry is responsible for massive amounts. I mean, look at who's naming buildings. And yes, of course, it's individual wealthy people, but it's also companies, corporations. You have universities that are kind of almost embedded or industry companies that are embedded in universities, whether it's Google, whether it's, Mallinckrodt is a sort of chemistry company, if you will. That's pretty interesting. And again, I don't have an answer for it, but what I think it does, John, is sort of, remind people, hopefully, that there is a complexity to this, and that, whacking one mole, three other moles are probably going to come up that we have to look at holistically. The problem right now is, whether it's, you want to say it's Steve Bannon's flood the zone kind of approach or whatever, I don't have. I mean, we're sitting here talking and it's like, I'm like, I should read every one of these documents 4 times. And that's what I would normally try and do. I haven't done that. I mean, A, I have 2 day jobs, but B, even if I had to, there's so many of them.
Believe me, I'm aware of this. I'm spending a lot of my time reading them. I want to close. This has been a great discussion. I want to close by just going back at the end here to talking about President Trump and this executive order. Many people have said that President Trump is widening or opening the Overton window to the political possibilities. What do you think about that, and especially with respect to science? Is the window being opened? How do you see that? And what I also want to be sure ask you about is that you haven't said anything here that I've heard you say elsewhere, especially in your piece for Inquisitive, I believe, about the scale of the disruption of science caused by this administration's order compared to some previous forms of disruption. Can you say something about the Overton window, and can you say something about how this order and this administration's actions affect science in terms of scale compared to others?
Yeah, and that's great, because we were talking the
Yes.
sort of Overton metaphor, if you will. I think in many ways, and I think this is not controversial, President Trump has, over the years, widened the Overton window in a number of ways. And I would argue probably the most important or biggest is just sort of the things he's allowed to say about sort of other people and about even foreign leaders and what have you. And language he's able to use, and the sort of attacks that you just wouldn't see from presidents, at least not publicly. So I think that we should just note that. It's not subject of our discussion, and I'm not an expert in it, but we should note that. On the other hand, I think that his administration has, in many ways, closed other parts of the Overton window. Like, that's what I see, this kind of, again, the details of which we want to both go back and check, but this sort of clear, at least intent, and sort of, whether it's anticipatory obedience or even overreaction that's happening, of things you can't talk about and you can't study, that again, whether it's neo or not, is definitely happening. And so I think that there's maybe it's a moving of the Overton window. And so, but again, if on the left you had people trying to close other parts of the Overton window, like you can't talk about this because it might cause harm, I think, again, it's all pretty consistent. In terms of the scale, again, it's hard as we sit here, what are we, I think today is the 20th. So we're a month into this administration. It's hard not to just point at it and say the scale of it. Now, and what do I mean? Well, as we were talking about,
it's hard to say the scale of it. What?
It's hard not to sort of look at the scale and say this is bigger and different than it's been, and on a different scale. And one area which we've already talked about is sort of, the sort of what you can put in papers or what you're allowed to study, but just the massive firings of people. Remember, so yes, everyone's looking at every agency. Trying to keep track of people who are being fired is basically impossible at this point, best I can tell. I'm sure someone's doing it, but a lot of these people are scientists. Look at what they're doing at the CDC, other agencies or the FDA. And it's not necessarily about research per se, right? This is what we're talking about, but just in terms of scientists and science, these are employees, they're federal employees whose job is, and you can argue about whether they do it well or not, but it is clear that if no one's doing it, no one does. No, if everyone's fired, nobody does it. Protecting us from, using science, using evidence, using research from, threats, whether it's, E. coli or drugs that are contaminated or pollution and what have you. Those are all being gutted. And so that to me is, again, separate from research, but that shows you the scale is just, it's much greater than we've seen before.
Interesting. Let me just suggest a metaphor. I'm going to change your metaphor a little bit and see if you would accept this suggestion. So when I think about the Overton window, it does refer to things like the kinds of rhetoric that are available and acceptable. But I think Overton window is being more essentially about a measure of the range of political possibilities that are open to discussion and active consideration. When a politician opens or shifts the Overton window, they shift the range of topics that now can be discussed. And many people think that a widening of the window can be a positive thing because it puts more things on the table. Not everyone agrees with that for harm-based reasons. But one might say, I think, that the Trump administration politically has in some ways shifted the Overton window, rhetorically, as you pointed out, but also has widened it in a variety of ways to include a whole bunch of political solutions on a whole range of topics that were not even being considered or talked about before. But here's a little twist I want to add for you. In the realm of science, would you accept the idea? What do you think of the idea that we might say the Trump administration is perhaps shifting and maybe opening the Overton window, but is also putting up a screen? It's putting a screen in the window that's now preventing a whole range of words and concepts even being discussed, even though the window may be more open in other areas.
I don't want to do the thing where I say, well, let's pick apart the metaphor precisely, because I see what you're saying, and I think I see where it's helpful. I would say, though, that I see it as more of a blackout shade on certain parts of it, because a screen, again, in the summertime, you like screened windows because they keep out the flies, but the fresh air still stays in. And so one thing we didn't talk about today is sort of what screening and peer review is actually, happening. And I talked briefly about RFK Jr. and sort of, being very selective about what you cite and what you refer to. So I actually maybe, and I would probably have to think about so I don't want to be sort of held to this, quote in a minute, later on.
You won't be held to it. No,
I understand.
No one
I'm
will
just
ever hear
saying,
this interview.
No. I mean, in a context-free way is what I mean. Like, I'm not opposed to screens, right? Because I don't think screens, I think if properly used, screens can actually separate, again, flies from fresh air. I like the fresh air. I'm not crazy about the flies, not being in my house anyway. And so, again, peer review is sort of supposed to be a screen of some kind. So I guess what I'm saying is I think that what they're doing, what the Trump administration is doing in terms of shutting down inquiry is more dramatic than a screen. I think if we had an entire Overton window with a screen, it'd probably be okay. I may regret saying that at some point because of how people construct that screen. But I don't think that's where they're going here.
So we want a screen, we might say, for in scientific research. We want screens, strong, thick screens for merit, for excellence, for contributions in the search for truth and understanding. But we're skeptical, or at least we have some worries about screens that are politicized in some way, even though the whole building is in some sense a liberal democratic society that's funded by the people and is for the people in some ultimate sense.
I think that works. I would add sort of things like rigorous methodology to
Good.
things we want, and we're screening in, if you will. We're screening out the bad methodology. But I think, again, right now, a lot of that is actually getting in other parts of the Overton window that are wide open because, again, peer review is so flawed because we have put so much effort into it. But that's a whole other subject.
Thanks for this conversation. I want to remind listeners that if you're interested in Ivan's work, please check out Retraction Watch, which he works on with his co-founder, Adam Marcus. I also encourage you to look at the issue of Inquisitive, the first issue of Inquisitive, with a great piece. The second issue of Inquisitive, which is forthcoming.
First issue for me.
The first issue for Ivan. And also there's a Q&A with Alice Dreger, with Ivan in HXA's blog, Substack blog, Free the Inquiry. Ivan Oransky, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thanks so much. Really a pleasure. A wonderful conversation.
It's been a pleasure talking with you.
Thank you for tuning in to today's episode. Heterodox Out Loud is a nonprofit production of Heterodox Academy. We rely solely on support of listeners like you. If you enjoyed today's episode, please follow our podcast, leave a rating or a review, and share it with your friends and network. Your support helps us reach more individuals who value diverse perspectives in higher education. If you are in higher education, visit heterodoxacademy.org and join the thousands of professors and students from all around the world who are working to support open inquiry. Until next time, I'm John Tomasi, reminding you that great minds don't always think alike.